Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa Bismillahi ma sha Allah. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. ربنا زدنا علما ربنا زدنا علما وفهما وعبدا كاملا ربنا يسر ولا تعسر. Assalamu alaikum everybody, and welcome to session 3 of the online course here on Seekers Guidance Online Academy, understanding the Fiqh and the science of crescent sighting, and this is session 3. Inshallah, sessions 1 and 2 has been of some benefit in understanding the issues surrounding a crescent sighting. We will now move on to potentially a more complex issue, and that is of local and global sighting. The issue is not so much complex in terms of the decisions that need to be made in terms of what would be, in my opinion, and I would say that in my educated opinion on the matter, is that the decision to go either global sighting or local sighting is not that difficult. What I mean by complexity is that the issue surrounding what boundary does the Muslim Ummah, the community, actually takes, is something which is really quite technical and quite scientific. I think it's probably more the issue of local and global sighting that actually causes us more difficulty every year, because of a sort of a lack of the understanding that this matter in fact constitutes. Now, I also want to preempt the discussion that we have today in this regard, and that is that with the matter of global and local sighting, the issue should not be just reduced to this idea of looking at some classical text and say, well, it is available, or a certain position has been stated in a particular text, and therefore that is our position. In my study of this matter, I have found that in fact that has not been the position nor the understanding of our classical scholars, that despite the fact that there is a small portion of discussion surrounding the possibility of the claim of, or the assertion of, in relation to global sighting, in no place do we find that the scholars are actually suggesting that this actually applies to the entire globe as a world, and something which we will look at later on, that how they understood global sighting, or the term sort of interpreted as global sighting, is very different to how we understand the matter today and how we in fact apply it. And I think our current contemporary scholars really do need to address this matter and attend to this matter by a systematic process in deciphering through the different views and opinions that may exist within a school, and obviously intra-school, and to come to a clear guideline for the Muslim community around the world about this matter. I will simply try in this session to give you an idea of the matters surrounding the discussions about local and global sighting, and without a doubt, obviously, my own personal opinion on this matter, and a pretty passionate one as well. And inshallah, you will be able to understand the points of view that actually has been presented, and it gives you an ability to take this discussion further with your imams, your scholars, your shuyukh around your community, and discuss this further. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there is much benefit from the discussions that we will be having here, that we already have had in sessions 1 and 2, here in session 3 about global and lunar sighting, and obviously in session 4 where we will be looking at some specific case studies about the continuing errors that do pop up every year, and particularly when it comes to matters around Ramadan and the 2 Eids, and look at how these errors do come up, and what are some of the ways we can in fact reduce it, if not eliminate it. In this session, we will be looking firstly at the definitions of local and global sighting, particularly from a classical text, and see what the scholars have said about this and what some of the classical positions in fact are. I actually am not going to go into the details of all the different views. I'm simply going to look at those views that is normally asserted to be the case, therefore providing some clarity for you in relation to whether local sighting or global sighting is acceptable. For example, there is no need for me to go into the details of the issues in the Shafi'i school or the Maliki school, although in the Maliki school there is a early opinion about global sighting, but there is simply no doubt that that the Maliki school in fact doesn't hold that view in practical terms anymore. Similarly with the Shafi'i school, but the general argument about global sighting normally surrounds the Hanafi school, the school in fact that I come from, and so I'll spend some time looking at some major scholars as to what they actually have said and how the platform has been set, which unfortunately continues to be ignored in much of the discussion, much of the discourse, and also the resources that often is provided to address the issue. So I'm going to really focus on those matters to provide in as simplest as possible the clarity on this matter without going into a plethora of information and technical data, both classical in terms of the Sharia as well as the scientific matters surrounding it. However, as I have said before, please do ask any questions that might provide you further clarification about this matter. So firstly, the local and global sighting definitions, and secondly, to look at some of the factual realities of what local sighting means and global sighting means. Again, just as a quick point, there is no need for me to go into too many details about local sighting. I think that's quite well understood, other than for me to provide you some definitional context about that. I will be spending a lot more time about discussing global sighting, and I can preempt for you, and inshallah you do not switch off, that in fact my very strong and passionate position is that that global sighting is something which is not in accordance with the objectives of the Sharia. And as I've said, these are my opinions which I will provide to you. And when I'm saying it's my opinions, I mean by that I am expressing it in practical terms to you via the transmission of the information of our great teachers and particularly the classical scholars who have said about this matter. And the third is to look at a specific example. Sometimes we do not realize that in fact, just like today we are sometimes arguing and debating about the issues whether we should go with local sighting or global sighting. In fact, in the first 150 to about 200 years of the Islamic history, the scholars also argued exactly the same way in relation to whether the Qibla should be in a southerly direction because the Medinan mosque faced southward towards Mecca. And we will see some specific examples of this and how over time scholars in fact realized, and also obviously because of the nature of the question, it in fact catapulted the Islamic scholars, the Muslim scholars, into trigonometry, astronomy, etc., etc., because of these kinds of particular questions. And these debates were easily answered, and once the facts were established, then there was no need to actually return to earlier views and suggest that somehow that Qibla around the world should be only southern. And as I've said, this was the view that was in fact held in the beginning the earlier part of the Islamic jurisprudential history, and we will look at that as an example, inshallah. So moving on to the first set of discussions in relation to the definitions of what local sighting is and what global sighting is. The standard Arabic term used for local sighting is اختلاف المطالع. And اختلاف المطالع, its I suppose literal meaning would be the difference in horizons, or difference in the points of rising, obviously, of the moon, and generally speaking referred to as a diversity of horizons around the world. Therefore, the crescent is to be sighted locally. We will look at the definition of local sighting a little bit later on. I'll move on to just providing a bit more introductory points about this before we look at each of these points in more detail. The second is global sighting, and the term used for that is ittihad al-matali', and ittihad al-matali' is basically a single horizon globally, as if the moon as if there was only one horizon upon which the moon in fact rises and sets on. And again, as I've said, we will be looking at that matter in much detail. The third, which I have thrown in, which is I think very important for us to attend to, because in fact part of the problem in today's world has been that crescent sighting tends to be attached in one way or the other to the sightings in Saudi Arabia, when in fact there is no Shari'i, no scientific reason for us to in fact do so. And we will look at that point firstly. Before we look at local sighting or global sighting, let's have a look at what does Saudi sighting refer to, and also why there is no such thing. Saudi sighting is that kind of sighting where different parts of the country, different countries around the world rely on sighting claims that in fact are made in Saudi Arabia, and therefore they make the announcements. In fact, Sheikh Al-Uthaymeen from Saudi Arabia has a fatwa about this matter, which makes it clear that they from Saudi Arabia have said as a fatwa that countries outside of the Saudi and the Arabian Peninsula should not follow Saudi sightings. That in fact they should follow local regional sightings themselves. So that's actually quite clear. We will see why in a minute as to why it is wrong or incorrect, in fact, to be following Saudi sighting, whether you are in the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand, etc. The second problem is a more implicit problem, and I will attend to this implicit problem in more detail in lesson 4, where some countries, for example, certain entities from within the United States, for example, who used to follow Saudi sighting, have simply relabeled and rebadged their processes to refer to what they now call it as global sighting. And I will look at that problem as well, because it unfortunately does nothing other than to confuse people even further when your data continues to point to Saudi Arabia, but you continue to deny that in fact that is what exactly they're doing. And I want to apologize well in advance that some of these discussions now, particularly in lesson 3 and certainly in lesson 4, may end up becoming quite particular, and I have no intention other than to simply highlight for us the issues rather than any entity or any person or any country, etc. It's more about looking at the issue specifically so that we can deal with them. So looking at the Saudi sighting in more detail as to why Saudi sighting is something that is incorrect and unacceptable. What I have done here is prepared a world map for you, and upon the map in fact placed the 12 new moons that occurred in 2009 or the 1430 Hijri calendar. And as you will see, none of these in fact have a rising, none of these actually formed as a new moon near Saudi Arabia. Now this actually has an implication. As an example, if you look at this here, this is the Muharram moon. This is approximately where the new moon of Muharram relative to Earth coordinates in fact was formed. So if it's formed here, the crescent will somewhere around here will actually become formed. If you look at Safar, again it will be on this side over here. If you're now going from Muharram, Safar, you have Rabiul Awwal over here, then Rabiul Akhir, back to Jumad al-Ula, Jumad al-Akhir, Rajab, Sha'ban, into Ramadan, into Shawwal, into Dhul Qidah, and into Dhul Hijjah. Now, as you can see, all of these are in different locations in comparison to the coordinates on Earth. Therefore, the formation of the crescent and its first visibility will never be in one location. Will never be in one location. It's simply impossible that the first sighting of crescent anywhere in the world will always be in Saudi Arabia. This is a simple scientific fact, and unfortunately, despite the calls from the Saudi scholars to let people know that in fact they should not be following Saudi sightings, they continue to do so. So I'm hoping that just this simple graphic explanation is helpful for you to understand why following simply Saudi sightings is something which is hugely incorrect and something we should completely ignore. And here is a technical graph of visibility. That this is, for example, for Safar in 2009. Around about somewhere here was when the moon was first formed as a new moon. And as you can see, the moon doesn't travel like the sun around in relation to Earth's coordinates. It's traveling in an elliptical orbital form around the Earth. And so what's going to happen here is that whilst the moon is actually formed here, it takes a little while before it actually, as we have spoken about in session 2, that it takes a while before the moon will in fact start to be visible. So this first one over here is, this first yellow here is more about what is referred to as the Danjon limit. And remember, we spoke about this in session 2. This is when if you would actually use telescopes and only in perfect conditions, and this is when telescopes will be used and generally speaking would be able to actually be sighted, and it goes further. And so basically what I'm saying is that, as you can see, it's around about here that for the first time the crescent would be sighted, not around here. This is Saudi Arabia over here, this is Mecca over here. In fact, for this map over here, in Mecca, for this moon, it will be only 6 hours old. So these are, as you can see, these ones over here, these are the hourly graphic representations, and it will be around about 6 or 7 hours old in Mecca. So there's no way that, for example, in January 2009, which is the Safar of 1430, that the moon could have been sighted for the first time on Earth in Saudi Arabia. And similarly, if we look at another map over here, which is for Jumad al-Akhirah, and if I can go back to the previous map, you look at this map over here, as you can see, the moon is behaving completely differently to, for example, this next one over here. We have the moon behaving extremely differently. The new moon is born somewhere around here, and it's traveling in this direction over here. And as you can see here, the possibility of visibility is in fact charted around about here. And this is hopefully also starting to give you a bit of an idea in relation to the fact that the crescent behaves completely differently, not only every month, but also in comparison to, or in relation to, sorry, to any part of the Earth. Now here, as an example, on 24th of May, whilst the moon is potentially visible here past North America, it's not even born. The moon was not even born in Australia. So global sighting becomes a problematic suggestion when we know that in fact the moon behaves completely differently, just like the sun does, in terms of at what point of time it is Dhuhr, Asr, etc., which we will be coming to very, very soon. I want to move on to now right in the deep end of the discussions surrounding global sighting. the first thing that I want to get out of the way before we get into some more detailed technical discussions, and that is the issue surrounding the claim about the Hanafi school. That the claim is that the Hanafi school has this dominant opinion or very popular opinion that in fact global sighting exists. The facts are completely opposite to that. The facts are that yes, there has been a general opinion that did exist, but in fact it was never acted upon, and we will look at some details about that. It never was acted upon in the sense that when we speak of global sighting in the entire world, and in fact within approximately 300 years of the Hijri calendar, the Hanafi school completely adopted the idea of regional or local sighting, which we'll be looking at in some detail as we go along. That in fact the original opinion of the scholars that global sighting is an opinion is in fact not incorrect in context to the geographical limitations that we will be seeing in a few minutes, inshallah. That opinion has to be looked at within the context of the time they actually said what they said, because this matter of issues surrounding local and global sighting is entirely ijtihadi, and its ijtihad is entirely based on natural facts rather than a shari'i fact per se. And also to understand that when we speak of a madhab, when we speak of a school, we're just not speaking of just one person, but we're speaking of collective scholars through a transmission of knowledge, and all of those things have to be taken into account, particularly when a matter in fact continues to be developed. And without a doubt, this issue of what is the extent of a region was a continuing development for approximately 150 to 200 years, and really ratified within the first 200 to 300 years of the Hijri calendar. And some of the examples of the scholars of to what they say that in fact it is local sighting, or what we would call regional sighting, and I will look at the differentiation between the two a bit later on, although for all semantic reasons they can be interchanged, that in fact Ibn Abidin in his Radd al-Muhtar makes a very clear statement. In Az-Zayla'i's Tabin al-Haqa'iq, he makes a very, very clear statement. Alauddin al-Kasani, Mullah al-Qari, and Shah Waliullah, some of the later scholars, make it very clear in relation to the school's position in relation to local sighting rather than global sighting. So here is a short statement of Ibn Abidin, rahimullahi ta'ala, and he says, there is no controversy regarding the acceptance of difference in the localities for crescent sighting. In other words, he's referring to local sighting. There is no controversy about this in his school, that's what he says. In the sense that there can be between two remote towns such that the crescent appears for one town on the one night without it occurring at the other, similar to the appearance of the sun. This is because the separation of the crescent from the sunlight varies between different regions. Just as if the sun declines in the east, it is not necessary that it also declines in the west. And the same is for the appearance of dawn and the setting of the sun. Rather, as the sun moves every degree, it can be dawn for one city and sunrise for another, and sunset for yet another, and midnight for the rest, as per the position of Az-Zayla'i. And this is Ibn Abidin in Radd al-Muhtar quite clearly mentioning about this matter, and his opening statement, Ikhtilaf al-Matali la niza'. In other words, there is no controversy on this matter. Yes, there were opinions, but these opinions were not something which were differences, but it was more so a developing juridical matter that needs to be understood from the usuli perspective of the Hanafi school. We look at what Az-Zayla'i says in his Tabin al-Haqa'iq, and he says it is mentioned amongst the Hanafi jurists, and he's referring to this issue of the difference between the local and the global sighting, that it is mentioned about the adherence to the acceptance of difference in the localities. In other words, the acceptance of local sighting over global sighting. This is because the Shari'i causation, this Shari'i sabab for the month and its commencement lies in the right of the people of a locality to see it without necessitating such commencement for others with a different horizon. Just as it happens that if the sun declines or sets upon one locality but not the other, then Dhuhr and Maghrib is obligated on the first but not on the other respectively. This is the point that Az-Zaylai makes, and this is the general position in the Hanafi school, despite the fact that the early positions did have an opinion about what would be referred to as global sighting. And as I have said, we have to actually take the term global with a grain of salt in understanding what exactly does the school really mean about that, or the scholars of the earlier times in fact mean. Interestingly, Az-Zaylai actually quotes I found it slightly humorous, of what he says in relation to as an analogy, as recorded by a discussion that in fact was asked of Allama Abu Musa in relation to what happens if a person, this is an analogy that is asked, and Az-Zaylai records this. He says, what happens to a person who is on a tower and he can see the sun? However, people on the ground see it as a sunset. In other words, the higher you go, the sunset time, in fact, will be affected. So he's being asked this question. If the people on the ground see that in fact the sun has set, but the person on the tower can still see the sun, can the person on the tower break their fast with the person on the ground? It's quite an interesting theoretical question. And the answer that Az-Zaylai records in his Tabyin is that no, the person on the ground will break their fast in accordance to when they experience sunset, as the person on the tower will break his fast or her fast when he or she will experience the sunset based on his or her conditions and circumstances. And this is, he refers to a hadith which is called the Qur'aib narration, in which Ibn Abbas speaks of the fact that he had rejected a claim of sighting in Syria when certain companions actually in fact had returned, which is something which we'll talk about a bit later on in some detail, inshallah. The second issue surrounding the global sighting is the assertion that the reliance is on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, this position, the position of global sighting, is primarily and almost entirely developed based on this particular hadith. And that is when the Prophet ﷺ said, كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, "Sumu li ru'yatihi waftaru li ru'yatihi." So they take this first part of the hadith and say that because of this, that when the Prophet ﷺ says fast upon sighting, that this actually applies anywhere, such that if one place cites it, then it becomes obligatory everywhere else. In other words, this is a statement of generality. This is a statement of what is referred to as a nasul am. It's for everybody. That in fact, therefore, everybody, as soon as one person cites the moon, sumu li ru'yatihi, therefore everybody should start fasting. However, this assertion, unfortunately, cannot be supported because of two very important legal grounds, and at least two. I mean, there's about 4 or 5 other reasons, but there is no reason for us to actually enter into some of those discussions at this point of time, and we will simply look at the 2 primary discussions or 2 primary reasons why such a claim cannot be supported. The first is that you have to look at the content of the remainder of the hadith, and we will look at that in some detail right now. And secondly, that there is in fact a failure of what is referred to as reductive reasoning within our usul principles, that in fact to actually make that kind of a reasoning, that simply because the statement is sumu li ru'yatihi waftaru li ru'yatihi, that fast upon citing it and break your fast upon citing it actually applies to one and all is in fact a failure of reductive reasoning. So let's first look at the content of the remainder of the hadith. And in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صوموا لرؤيته وافطروا لرؤيته فإن غم عليكم فاكملوا عدة شعبان 30 يوما ثم صوموا. In other words, this part over here we speak of فإن غم عليكم. This part is not quoted when we speak of this. And so when we look at this hadith in detail, if we are to say that the first part of the hadith is about fast upon citing it and break upon fasting it to apply to everybody, then what about the second hadith, which is actually talking about, and should it be obscured from you? Now, it would be absurd for us to think that there will be clouds universally everywhere in the world. So I hope you can understand that the hadith is actually talking about a particular, not a universal. Should it be obscured from you is without a doubt, it has nothing to do with the universality of an application. It's about particular and specific. It cannot be on the one hand apply to everybody, and then a condition in terms of obscurity can only be for particulars. This obviously would be absurd and illogical in our understanding of the hadith. So we are speaking of the hadith that in fact it is speaking about فَإِنَّ غُمَّ عَلَيْكُمْ, and it should be obscured from you. In other words, in your locality, then complete 30 days of Sha'aban, then start fasting. The hadith is absolutely clear that this is not a hadith of universality, but in fact a hadith which is geo-specific. We move on to the failure of reductive reasoning. If we are to say that sumu li ru'yatihi waftaru li ru'yatihi is this application for everybody, let's have a look at some of the verses from the Quran which in fact are stated in a similar, very similar way, and we know ourselves because of our prayer times that this does not apply to everybody at the same time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna as-salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta, that indeed prayer has been obligated upon the believers at decreed times. In other words, at fixed and specified times. And we know that obligation on a believer at one location of specific time is not an obligation on another at a different region. The sabab is prescribed. The sabab is that in fact there will be decreed times for it. Obviously the hadiths make it more clear what those decreed times are for us. And we could not say that simply because one person observes, say for example, sunset, that does not mean that everybody in the world has to now pray Maghrib. And the sabab being prescribed, and it must be present for the one obligated. In other words, the sabab is applicable to the one it's obligated to, not someone who does not actually experience the sabab in itself. Another verse of the Quran is the famous verse about the black and the white thread, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the time of fasting, and he says, and eat and drink until the white thread of the dawn becomes distinct from the black thread, then complete the fast up to nightfall. Of course, we all know that it would be illogical to think that simply because one person experiences in, say for example, the United States, in California, that this somehow, that he has actually experienced the true dawn to come in, that this would now apply to the rest of the world. This obviously is illogical, and we know because the issues around prayer has been very well resolved, and we no longer have to think through those matters, and it becomes very much second nature. Unfortunately, the matters surrounding crescent sighting, or the existence of the crescent as a sabab, continues to become an issue because unfortunately the community does not get involved in the development of the understanding and awareness of this matter as much as we do about salah, for example. Obviously for priority reasons, but what I'm saying here more so is the issue that actually we understand one but not the other, but we have to realize they're both the same principles. the third part, the third issue that needs to be looked at in relation to the global sighting is that in fact, when we are looking at the scholarly opinion, it was limited to a geographical extent. It is going to be disingenuous and quite incorrect, in my personal opinion, to suggest that the original or the earliest opinion somehow did apply to the rest of the world, when in fact the scholars did not know of the extent of the world. And in fact, we have scholars who are, for example, as Zailai himself mentions about the new information that actually is arriving to the scholars, telling them about the new lands and all of the different issues they're in fact confronting in such matters of prayer and qibla, etc. So they are becoming aware of this in the earliest time, approximately 150 years from the time of from the calendar of the Hijrah. But by the time it comes to 200 to 250 Hijrah, but definitely by the 300 Hijri of the lunar calendar, this issue becomes quite firm and clarified. So the issue of local versus global sighting is entirely a matter of ijtihad, as I've said before, based on known facts of the time. It really relies almost exclusively on the issues of natural factors, understanding natural issues, and then making the decisions on this. And issues such as this precisely, in fact, led to the development of astronomy because of prayer times and lunar months. In fact, if you look at what is referred to as Zij tables in the science of astronomy, you will see many of the scholars are trying to resolve the issues surrounding prayer times and lunar months in particular areas. So they're starting to learn that in fact the way that the issue surrounding prayer times and lunar months was, for example, in Mecca, is not the same in, say, for example, in Khorasan, or say, for example, in Hind, and today obviously here in Sydney, Australia, or in Auckland, New Zealand, or Tokyo, Japan, for example. And also the sciences of trigonometry, because of Qibla, and the inventions of sundials in itself was to actually record this matter for the different locations and regions, rather than this idea of a globalized position. And the opinions were based on the known world, and that's the reason why, whilst the scholars on the one hand were becoming familiar with the scientific and factual information that was coming to them, they were still speaking about the known world that was known to them. And it is clear, and we hold the view very firmly, that the position of the scholars, the most esteemed scholars, mashallah, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, were in fact not incorrect. They were correct for their context geographically. But we can't apply that, as the geography has now, without a doubt, changed, and changed meaning that we now have a world which is a much greater world, and I'll explain that point in a few minutes, inshallah. And the rulings evolved over time as new facts were known. And in fact, many rulings of Islam evolved in such a manner. For example, prohibited kinds of alcohol within the Hanafi school. For example, how alcohol rulings actually have been developed did not actually come in one instance. The different gradations of alcohol and an understanding of that certainly came over an evolutionary period. Over here, obviously, time evolution rather than a Darwinian evolution. And also the same thing about Qibla direction. In fact, it'll be our case study to see how this idea of actually applying what was understood in Medina and Mecca, and to actually apply that globally, in fact existed in relation to the Qibla. And very, very soon, within the own time of approximately 100 to 150 years, the matter of Qibla direction was resolved, and it became what we would call today as variable horizons, or what we would call localized Qibla, as the point would be about localized sighting for the crescent. And obviously prayer times as well. It was one of the first things that was resolved very, very quickly in relation to prayer times, that in fact prayer times do differ in different parts of the region. And here is a map that tells us basically the known world of the scholars at the time when they spoke of the so-called global sighting. It's basically this larger circle over here. And for your information, that circle is a bit exaggerated, but that's fine. However, also importantly, these two inner circles really were the places where much of the juridical discussions were happening, and many of the scholars, mind you, were in fact only talking about matters that they really understood in their own geographical locations. So putting aside that in fact the larger Muslim community and the exploration and discoveries was actually happening out here, the scholars were still pretty insular in this discussion around about here. And for your information, if you look at this entire extent over here, if you look at these timelines over here, I have actually moved the time zone as the standard 0 onto Makkah here, approximately. And if that's 0, then the world that was known at the time of the approximately 200 to 300 after Hijrah is no more than plus or minus 4 hours. In other words, the time difference between the edges of the world here and the edges of the world of here is plus 4 minus and minus 2 hours approximately. So you're really looking at approximately 4 to 6 hours of an entire difference of time. And you and I know today that that is not a great amount of time in order to be able to deal with the issues of moon sighting. And in fact, the scholars at this point of time that we are exactly speaking about right now is for the first time asking the question whether there is in fact a different horizon, and therefore the points actually we see in Az-Zaylai's, for example, position, in Ibn Abidin's position, for example, later on, etc., that in fact is recorded, that in fact whilst we will still speak of this larger world out here, you know, really ultimately no more than 2.5 hours of time difference was really actually understood over here. And so the entire region is no less than, you know, no more than 4 hours in time difference, and almost all juridical data were in the inner circles, as I have mentioned. And one of the most important points that needs to be understood, that there is not a single scholar who spoke about the so-called global sighting actually spoke about the entire world in reality. The factual evidences regarding lunar behavior had only just started to emerge. The scholars, the Shari'i scholars, as well as the astronomers who themselves, many of them in fact were fuqaha themselves, they're interacting and discussing at this point of time. So we are talking about an evolution of the fiqh of this matter rather than an end of the matter. And so to suggest that in fact there was a difference of opinion as a final position is something that is not in fact entirely true. And the issue was quite negligible. I mean, we're talking about, you know, such a small distance, you know, 2, 3, 4 hours of a time difference, as opposed to today's 12 to 24 hour time differences, as well as complicating that when you're actually looking at the entire globe of the world and the lunar behavior. I mean, here, just a quick point, and we will see this in some detail in a minute. This line here, which is the equatorial line here, really divides the world into a northern and a southern hemisphere. And believe it or not, the lunar behavior in relation to how it forms, the crescent forms, behaves very differently to, say, for example, if the orbital, the relative orbital positions are in fact in the southern hemisphere as opposed to, say, for example, in the northern hemisphere. Even the southern and the northern hemisphere make a huge difference. And when you look at the world that we are talking about here, they're entirely in the northern hemisphere. And so the lunar behavior limitations was not even at this point of time a real issue for the scholars to consider. However, they were already considering it, mashallah, and they were already coming to a conclusion, to a very finite conclusion, that in fact local sighting is the most appropriate decision to make as far as sighting was concerned. We move on to looking at the lunar behavior and understanding that in fact lunar behavior is region specific and it is not globally synchronistic. You can't say that what actually happens at, say, for example, as far as the lunar position and the lunar behavior and the crescent possibility of sighting in, say, for example, California in comparison to, say, for example, in Adelaide, Australia. They're very different, and it is very relative to the locality or the region. The relative location of the new moon conjunction occurs, as we have seen in the first diagram, in all different locations of the globe, as opposed to the first crescent, which also obviously will occur in all different parts of the world. I have just also mentioned that the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere behavior is actually quite varied, and it's not the same at all. We also, if you properly follow the crescent sighting, by the way, if we did follow crescent sighting appropriately with as accurate information and data in front of us, that we will in fact see that the entire globe, the entire world will be reconciled well within the 24-hour time frame, as opposed to today's, approximately 2, sometimes 3 days, because of the mishaps of the ideas of whether it's pre-calculation or whether it's global sighting or whether it in fact is following the new moon, etc., causing all the difficulties we have in today's world. And the significant variation in dates is solely due to the use of incorrect dates. The variation of 2 to 3 days is not because of the moon sighting. It's actually because of the predetermined calendars, as well as the global sighting assertions that actually people follow through. And if we were to follow the crescent sighting, as I have said, the local and the regional sighting itself will in fact reconcile all areas of the world well within the 24-hour time period. And in fact, that's the modern man-made time device, as we would speak, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and the way the international dateline works. But if you look at real time, and we will look at an example just now, in most cases, the reconciliation via naked eye crescent sighting is always less than 12 hours in real time. So here is an example I'm going to use as a case study, 2 particular cities. We are looking at Rabi al-Awwal of 2009 here. This crescent visibility sighting chart that we see in front of us is for Rabi al-Awwal in 2009. And just for information, all of these yellow looking parts of the diagram is where the crescent can't be sighted. In fact, you're starting to see the telescope here could be used. It's actually in this orange here that we say that in fact naked eye sighting will be possible if it's a clear day. So we will look at 2 particular cities. One is Sydney, Australia, for example, on this particular Rabi al-Awwal of 2009, and a city that is going to be within the easily sightable region, and that is San Francisco. So these particular 2 cities, let's have a look at the data and look at exactly what was happening here so that we can make an analysis about what is local sighting and what is global sighting about this issue. So Rabi al-Awwal of 2009, they had its new moon form at approximately 1:46 in the morning at Greenwich Mean Time, or the universal time coordinate, and that equates to, for Sydney, the new moon conjunction, this 1:46 over here equates to 11:46 a.m. of 25th of February, and that's in Sydney. And the same time equates to San Francisco's 5:46 p.m. of 25th of February. So on this 25th of February, as you can see the chart over here, on this standardized dating system that we have today, on this 25th of February, as you can see here, the moon will be, the crescent will be sightable, inshallah, and it in fact was sightable in San Francisco over here. If you look back here in Australia, the moon actually had already set 33 minutes before sunset. The moon had already set. In other words, the so-called same date, global date, in one region, the moon had already set. It's impossible to witness the suburb. Remember, this is a matter of fiqh. This is a matter of fiqh in order to complete our devotional act with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Sydney, on the 25th of February, the moon had already set 33 minutes before sunset. In other words, the moon was below horizon. It will be impossible to be sighting the moon, obviously, straight after sunset. However, on the same day, on the 25th of February in San Francisco, the moon, in fact, would be setting 1 hour after sunset. 1 hour after sunset, and the sighting was highly possible. In fact, it was sighted. Now, when it was sighted at San Francisco, in other words, if we now compare this to time-wise, so what does 25th February 1746 in San Francisco equate to Sydney? It actually equates to 26th February 12:30 p.m. in Sydney. 26th February 12:30 p.m. in Sydney. And for your information, the correct sighting date in Sydney was 26th of February. 26th of February. And just for your information, sighting in San Francisco was confirmed. The 26th of February will be 1st of Rabiul Awwal, and the sighting in Sydney was confirmed by sighting of the moon on the 26th, that in fact 27th of February will be the 1st of Rabiul Awwal. Therefore, the real time difference between San Francisco and Sydney is only 6 hours. Only 6 hours different. However, if Sydney had adopted the so-called global sighting standards and adopted 26th as its first day, there will be a complete 24-hour real time difference between the two cities. Now, you can see that by local sighting, you are actually attaining a global unification within the 24-hour day, what is referred to as a nahar wal layl, al-yawm. 24 hours, you actually attain it. But when you're speaking of global sighting, the idea is to actually have this unified approach. You're actually not even close to the idea of unification. You are so far apart. In fact, the local sighting allows you to actually be closer in time, in real time, rather than the Greenwich Mean Time International Dateline time system, which sometimes is very, well, not sometimes, in fact, it can be very confusing to people, that when we speak of 27th here and 26th here, what does it really mean? In some cases, the actual real difference is so little, and in some cases, obviously, the time differences can be quite a lot. So the fact is that the aims of global sighting for a unified lunar month, for Ramadan or for the Eid, does not meet the reality or the objectives of the Sharia. It is very clear that that is the case. I want to now just briefly attend to local sighting and simply understand it from a definitional perspective, because there is no need for us to go into any more detail about local sighting. Local sighting simply means to actually sight from your own locality, and what do we mean by that in some detail. Firstly, local sighting is not only for one city. That's not what local sighting really means. It really means a region that fulfills the meeting of the sabab, remember the causation, and the ghair takalluf. In other words, the non-bearing of the difficulty upon a community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not want to burden anybody any more than a person can bear. La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. All of these are actually statements that are actually very clear in our fiqh and as principles, as qawaid that we understand. So if we actually have a situation where there is no great amount of waiting, and some of these things can be subjective, and inshallah we have these kind of discussions in our Q&A time, that actually how far does each region have the ability to spread. Obviously there is a theory that in fact we could actually have what is called a tri-zonal world, and inshallah if somebody is interested we can talk a bit more about that. But here we simply mean an area which is within a jurisdiction, within the authority of people who can control, we can manage, and in fact we can, in which people, the authorities can decipher the claims of sighting. And that would be the local or the regional sighting area. So for example, for us here in Australia, we have what is called the Australian National Crescent Sighting Coordination Center, and we coordinate through a very thorough assessment process of all sighting claims in Australia. However, we would not be able to, for example, rely on New Zealand, although that actually has its own technical problems, but more so from a socio-geographic position. We from Australia would not be able to, at least at the moment, not be able to clarify or verify the witnesses, the claims of the witnesses themselves. Therefore, authorities have always agreed that a particular region, what we would define as a country or a group of countries that actually fulfill the asbab and the issues surrounding takalluf, that in fact people are not burdened, then this would form a region which can be referred to as ikhtilaf al-matali', or more appropriately, I think, and this is a term I prefer to use myself, a phrase that I prefer to use, and that is afrad al-aqtar. And so this would form one community of sighters that will rely on each other for the claims of sighting as well as the assessment for the final decisions to be made. The second issue around local sighting is that local sighting actually aims to simply fulfill the sabab. Its aim is not anything else other than to simply worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appropriately. And the aim is to meet the Sharia requirements of worship, including any differences of opinions that in fact can and does exist in our Islam. However, things which are not factual and don't meet the Sharia requirements is not acted upon. We can't say that simply because somebody holds an opinion, even if that opinion is factually wrong, to be somehow part of Sharia. And we have seen the definition of this in the discussion surrounding evidences and witnesses, as Imam al-Subki, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Burhanuddin, etc., who have in fact mentioned about the issue surrounding the factuality of evidences which would be part of our Sharia. The third issue is that local sighting in fact unites the Ummah, as opposed to the various other pre-calculated global sighting approaches that people take, which in fact separates people in reality. And remember that unity for our Ummah is not the start point. Unity is not the start point. It's actually the result of doing things right. It's a result of doing things right with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, this is a very important verse that as Imam al-Qurtubi, for example, said, that the habl of Allah, the robe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the truth, is the Quran. Right? So it's not unity, it's the truth. So if we all hold on to the truth, if we all hold on to the things which are factually right, therefore unity will come, not the other way around. And inshallah that makes some sense. And the last point in that regard is that local sighting really does reconcile all locations on earth well within 24 hours in terms of the international dateline time calculation, and within 24 hours of real time. I apologize, there's a typographical error over there. It should simply read, and within 12 hours of real time. Here I want to quickly look at the last point of our discussion for lesson 3, is that the original Qibla problem that the Muslim community in fact suffered from in relation to this idea or this assertion by the early community that there is a global direction, and how our Qibla in fact evolved from this idea of global direction into what we see today as localized direction, geospecific direction for the Qibla. and I'm very hopeful that inshallah, in relation to moon sighting, we will also move from this issue approximately 1431 years after, but inshallah we'll try and come to this idea that we don't actually have to have this idea of global sighting, that in fact local sighting or localized sighting in relation to geospecific matters is what is required by and countenanced by our Sharia. The information here is well referenced in the works of one of the most, if not the most detailed research work that was done by a great scholar by the name of David King in a publication called In Synchrony with the Heavens, Studies in Astronomical Timekeeping and Instrumentation in Medieval Islamic Civilization. And in that he provides detailed empirical information about how what we are about to discuss here in fact occurred. So I'm going to explain to you as examples 3 particular cities and look at what actually happened in relation to the Qibla. If you look at Cairo, for example, here, the correct Qibla is approximately 136 degrees. However, the angles that were used are these ones here in developing, building mosques in Cairo. And the number of earliest mosques that actually was studied that actually had their angle for Qibla at 180 degrees, which is local for Medina, in fact were 2/3 of the masjid that in fact were built. So just as a quick diagrammatic explanation of this, what does it mean by 180 degrees here? If we look at, say for example, if Medina is here, if this is Medina, Mecca is around about here somewhere. So this is Mecca and obviously Kaaba. And so the direction of prayer is southward. So this is a southward direction, and you could say that this is approximately 180 degrees, the way that surveyors in fact measure. And just to look at how, say for example, the surveyors in fact measure this is a quick diagram over here. And you can divide the circle into 4 quadrants like this, and normally this is referred to as the 0 degrees, and this is normally the north, and this is 90, and this is 180 degrees, and this is 270 degrees. So you can see this 180 degrees is why this is here is referred to as 180 degrees, because it's pointing southward. So that's obviously east, and that is south, and that is west. So this here is 180 degrees. And so when we're looking at the case study and as an example of Cairo, we're looking at Cairo, for example. Cairo is approximately here. Then its direction to Mecca is approximately, in the 130 degree odd mark towards Mecca. And if you look at the correct Qibla is about 136 degrees, and that would be the correct Qibla. But the point is that because there was this idea that we could actually replicate the Meccan Medinan model everywhere else, then in fact 2/3 of the masjids in the earliest time were in fact built in this way, rather than actually the correct Qibla direction that would be approximately 136 degrees. Similarly, if you look at the Cordoban mosques, for example, again the direction for 180 degrees, Cordoba is up. If you look at Cordoba, Cordoba is around about here somewhere. Obviously, these are very approximate sort of diagrams. And from here to Mecca is approximately about 100 degrees. However, again, according to David King's measurements, and in fact there are about 3 different scientists actually who have gone and measured this, that again in Cordoba around about 75% of the mosques are in fact built in, unfortunately, in the north-south direction like this. And why? Because they're simply applying the Medinan situation into here, and unfortunately facing in a completely wrong direction. Now, the most interesting one, and I think I would call it quite a cute little error that in fact had crept in, is obviously our Hanafi school, mashallah. And this is the Samarkand situation here that we find in terms of the measurements. And Samarkand is approximately the land we would call today more so the Near East of the Afghanistan sort of lands in that region as well. So there's no need for us to go into the details exactly where it is, but it's in that region in itself. Now, this will take a bit of an interesting explanation to show as to how the scholars had in fact decided as to the direction for Qibla will be from Samarkand, and most of the scholars in the Samarkand were Hanafi scholars, and so they decided on this idea of global Qibla based on the experience of Makkah, which I'm going to explain now, inshallah. Essentially, again, let's make an assumption that, say for example, that Makkah is around about here, and Samarkand is up here somewhere. The true Qibla from Samarkand to Mecca is approximately 240 degrees. This is approximately, actually it's 239 degrees approximately. That's the accurate Qibla from Samarkand to Mecca, to the Kaaba. However, the Hanafi scholars of the earliest times used their best ijtihad to work out the Qibla from Samarkand to Mecca based on the experience of from Mecca. What they experienced was when they used to come to do their pilgrimage, their Hajj in Mecca, they experienced one thing, and that is that the road back home, I just wanted to make a point, I'm not making this up, inshallah, we will all understand from, how factual information as they come along, and it helps in these kind of matters to be resolved and evolved is the point I'm trying to make. And I find this amazing that our scholars made all matters to be of important and serious ijtihad. They didn't just make kind of a half-baked and willy-nilly kind of idea of matters. Even if they got it wrong, they really did spend their time to get things right, to understand how they would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I'm not making this up, all right? So bear with me here. The Hanafi scholars who left Mecca experienced that the road to Samarkand from Mecca in fact left in this direction over here. Okay, so we could say that this is approximately in our modern survey, this is 90 degrees. This is what their experience was. When they got to Samarkand, they didn't sort of realize that in fact they would probably have to travel all sorts of ways to actually get here. What they did was they literally built their mosques the opposite direction, and this is clearly marked in the works of the Hanafi fuqaha and the astronomers of the time. and they built the Qibla at the what is referred to as 270 degrees. So instead of understanding that in fact you can't take your experience here and somehow replicate it anywhere else all over the world, you need to look at the local situation. What is the local situation over here? And the local situation is clear that in fact the Qibla is in this direction over here. This is our Qibla here. And that's by understanding local geospecific circumstances in all our matters. This is a very, very important point that needs to be understood, and this inshallah explains to you and gives you a clear guideline of how the so-called global Qibla direction issue was resolved by an evolution, by an understanding of matters based on very important scientific facts that the scholars and the so-called scientists of the time, they were scholars themselves, obviously, mashallah, who developed a clear understanding, and they rectified these matters in an appropriate manner, and they never carried on about this. I mean, we no longer have a situation in today's world, although there's some places here and there you still have this kind of debate and argument, but by far and large we have moved on from the issues of Qibla direction, and it's no longer a matter that we have to continue to somehow address. But inshallah, as I have said before, that Allah give us tawfiq about the same in relation to our crescent sighting. I just want to return to the page over here that the closest, mashallah, the closest in getting the Qibla direction right, say for example in Cairo, were the companions, and they used the stars to work out the Qibla, and they were the closest in that direction. In fact, some of the mosques that were built straight after the companions are in fact in a completely opposite direction there, which is 90 degrees, and 10th century calculation, and that's approximately 300 after Hijrah. So we're speaking about a similar kind of time which you're just talking about, the crescent sighting, and he worked it out to be 127 degrees and approximately just about 9 degrees off from the more accurate 136 degrees. And in Cordoba, in fact, they had worked the Qibla, as I said, 75% of the mosques in the early Cordoban times were in fact in the so-called globalized idea of replicating Medinan direction everywhere else. And we have just spoken about the Samarkand situation. And here again, even there, they had, I'm not sure of how many mosques in comparison to the Hanafi travel issue that actually crept into the Qibla direction. I'm not quite sure how many mosques were in fact built which were simply a replication of the location for Medina as a global replication over there. However, it certainly did happen, and it was not uncommon. It was quite prevalent. I also want to highlight for you that in fact, if you look at the use of celestial objects, it is in fact the closest to the directions to the Qibla. Then inshallah we have an opportunity one day to actually hold a class on astronomy here on Seeker's Guidance Online, in which we can also look into further details of how to accurately use celestial objects, the sun for example, the stars at night time, etc., to in fact tell accurate Qibla whilst we are traveling, for example, or when we have moved into a new region or new locality, how to very quickly able to actually work these kind of things out using the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah, that has helped you to understand much of the discussions that tends to surround the assertions about global sighting, and allows you to understand why local sighting is not only the most appropriate answer to our crescent sighting woes, that in fact it is also the most appropriate way to achieve unity amongst Muslims around the world. Inshallah, session 3 has been of benefit to you. As I have asked you before, that if you have any questions, please ask in the forum or in the live session that we will have with each other. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the information that has been provided to you thus far has been of much benefit, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you tawfiq, and inshallah your preparations for Ramadan is coming very, very well, and you're also enjoying the classes and learning much from our great and most esteemed Sheikh Faraz Rabbani's classes in relation to the virtues and the fiqh of fasting, as well as living the Quran in Ramadan. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.